All right, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the Layering Your Dispute Strategy to Protect Against Loss and First-Party Misuse. My name is Greg Whitten. I'll be one of the presenters today. Before we get started here, let's kind of go through a quick agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. So on our agenda, we're going to be talking about key learnings regarding disputes and chargebacks, what influence factors and the negative downstream effects of those. Deeper insights into compelling evidence 3.0. This was a rule launched by Visa and Verifi a little over a year ago. We're going to do a deeper dive into that. And then really just talk a little bit about how automation in general can help unburden merchants or even anyone in the payment ecosystem, being able to use this technology to create better processes, gain efficiencies, lower costs, and all those fun things. So as I mentioned, my name is Greg Whitten. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Verifi, focused on working with merchants directly. So if you're a merchant on this call, you've probably spoken to me or somebody on my team at one point in time. Also with me is Babak Das, Verifi Head of Product. So Babak, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Absolutely. Thanks, Greg. I'm Babak Das. I've been in the payments industry for over 25 years now. I run Verifi's pre-dispute product. So if you have a product question, you know who to reach out to. Very happy to be here with you all. Back to you.
Thanks, Babak. And one other housekeeping item real quick before we move on is we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A section here of the tool, and we will address as many of those as we possibly can towards the at the end of the webinar. All right. So with that, let's get started here. So what we like to do here at Verifi when we lead one of these webinars is really talk about kind of macroeconomic environment, or macroeconomic environment to kind of set the stage for how this really influences the post-purchase experience and disputes. So here's just a couple of stats that we found really kind of applicable to what we're going to be talking about today. And if you're interested in where these stats come from, this actually comes from the fraud and the fraud report that Verifi puts together with other participants in the payments ecosystem to really call out anything fraud related, chargeback related in the payments ecosystem. So if you haven't seen this report yet, we can make that available to you. It's a really good read if you want to really kind of dive in and see what other merchants are reporting that's happening real time in the market today. But a couple of these stats really kind of leapt at us on this year's in this year's report. The first stat here, 63% of merchants cited an increase in first-party misuse. Now, I want to caveat that with this isn't 63% of merchants reported first-party misuse. This is an increase in the last 12 months. So a huge amount of merchants are seeing overall first-party misuse increase across the board. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this category, first-party misuse, just know that this is the kind of the newest terminology for friendly fraud, where essentially a consumer makes a purchase, knowingly accepts it, and then claims fraud on the back end, really just trying to get that product or service for free. So this is a huge problem and it's continued increasing. Secondly, here is 3% of total e-commerce revenue is lost by lost to payment fraud by merchants globally. So when I first saw that stat, I really wasn't too impressed with the 3% number. But when you think about that collectively on the billions and maybe even trillions of dollars that get processed through e-commerce, 3% makes up a huge amount of that. And I just really started to frame it for myself, started thinking about publicly traded companies that have very low profit margins, say let's in the single digit ranges. If they were able to cut out this 3% fraud and add that to the bottom line, that would be a huge increase overall in their overall business. So again, looks small at the beginning, but I think the impact that has on commerce globally is very significant. So that's one of the things that we see here. Now, as we move to kind of this next slide, we want to talk a little bit more about in detail how disputes can cause problems downstream. So if you're in this business, these are probably something you live and breathe every day. But with these disputes, essentially what will happen is these disputes create risk across the entire payments ecosystem, right? So whether you're an acquirer, an issuer, or a merchant, you're seeing these risks come in and these losses can accrue. And when this happens, there are also additional fees and costs that come along with these. Revenue is impacted, obviously, if you're seeing disputes coming in and you're having to try to win those. And if you're a merchant, if you lose those disputes, that comes off the top line. An increase in overall fraud, which none of us want to see, because not only are you losing sales, but if you're a physical goods provider, as an example, you're actually losing the cost of that good overall. And then also just the negative customer experience, right? So this really comes along when cardholders really need help and they're trying to get help, and for whatever reason they deem it is not something that they really want to pursue directly with the merchant or the payment participant. And so they have a negative experience, and so they create these, file a dispute because it's the path of least resistance for them. And most importantly, Babak, these disputes across the entire payment ecosystem actually cost money.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, I was reading the 2023 Global Payments and Fraud reports also, and the stats, like you said, are indeed staggering. So for all types of fraud, phishing, farming, and whaling attacks are the most prevalent ones. But the first-party misuse comes a close second. It costs merchants on an average $75 to resolve a first-party misuse dispute. That is significant. I also saw that merchants spend an estimated 35%. So they spend $35 to manage every $100 of friendly fraud dispute. So this hits their bottom line quite a bit. So I'm sure this is one of the most significant line items in their P&L. So the question becomes, how can you help merchants reduce the cost of dispute and increase the efficiency of combating the fraud? Greg, I know you have done some research recently into how automation and artificial intelligence will impact businesses and the global economy. Would you like to share some of your findings?
Sure. Thanks, Babak. And you're very gracious with saying your research. So so what I want to do is really quick, again, just touch on the subject of automation and artificial intelligence. And to be honest with you, when I kind of did my dive, and by the way, I'm still a novice at this. There's still a lot of things that I don't know, but there's a lot of things I learned just spending a little bit of time in the last couple of months understanding the impacts of AI, and especially what very smart people think the impact of automation AI will have on commerce globally. And so what we want to do is talk about these a little bit, and then we'll kind of tie this back again to the post-dispute process. So again, a couple of stats we're going to throw at you. There's only a couple more, I promise. So $15.7 trillion in boost to the GDP of the world economy by 2030. So that's what, 6 years, less than 6 years from now is the impact. That's a huge increase across the entire global economy. Secondly, here, the 62% of reduction in business costs savings for about 5.8 trillion by 2035. So kind of the tale of both sides of the coin, right? So there are estimates saying that AI and automation are kind of going to increase top line revenue while also kind of creating efficiencies and reducing costs. And what that means for businesses in the global economy that are taking advantage of these solutions, it's going to create more of a spread for them when it comes to creating additional profit margin, or allow them to use that to continue to invest in other aspects of their business to continue to grow their businesses across whatever vertical they tend to focus on. And then lastly here, this is one that really kind of stood out to me and took me by surprise here. Well, 62% of consumers have higher emotional attachment to a brand that uses AI to enhance their experience. So a couple of notes on this. I think the first one is I was really surprised. And I think that, one of the things we learned about this is that consumers are open to companies using AI first and foremost, right? And it's not like they are completely turned off by it. So however businesses choose to implement any sort of AI and automation, consumers are okay with it as long as it's effective, right? So as long as those chatbots that we're implementing or any other sort of solutions help customers, then they are more than willing to continue to work with those companies. But second to that is consumers are setting a new expectation with businesses that are using this, because the consumers expect that these companies will actually make recommendations to them, personalized on kind of who they are, how they spend, those types of things. So they want to use AI, or they expect AI to make these recommendations so they can get a more of a customized experience with the companies that they're using. And so they're seeing things that they're interested in and not seeing things that they're not necessarily interested in. So really kind of interesting fact here. So we're going to tie all this back in towards the end here as well. But one more slide we want to talk through real quick here. And this is there's two stats. Promise these are the last ones. 94% of merchants experienced first-party misuse and fraud attacks in 2023, according to the Fraud and Payments Survey. Now, I was kind of surprised by this number. Not that it's 94%, but that it's not 100%. So, I think that most merchants that were surveyed recognize the fact that they do have first-party misuse, aka friendly fraud, and the other 6% probably just didn't know that they were experiencing first-party misuse. I think that number is probably closer to 100% than 94%. And secondarily here, the number one fraud attempt amongst most enterprise businesses is first-party misuse. So not only is it number one, but as we saw on the previous slide, these metrics continue to grow year over year at an exorbitant rate. So guess what we're trying to say simply is that this is a big problem, and we need solutions to help solve that problem. All right. So a problem, to take this sort of problem on at a global scale requires global thought leadership on this. And really that's where Visa and Verifi have partnered to really try to solve this for all of the payments ecosystems across the board. So last year, Visa launched the first-party misuse rule titled Compelling Evidence 3.0. And really what this was designed to do was prevent this friendly fraud from actually coming in and into the payments ecosystem and creating this havoc that we're seeing in these surveys. So it's been in the market for just over about a year now. But Beck, I know you have been close to this rule and the implementation of this rule. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this rule here?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be happy to, Greg. So like Greg mentioned, Visa and Verifi released the Compelling Evidence 3.0 rule change last year. It's rule change because compelling evidence was there previously, but this is a significant change to the rule that actually helps merchants. I'm sure this is sounding familiar to some of you here. You may have participated in a previous webinar, or you may have seen our communication, but nevertheless, let me give you a quick overview of the rule for those who are relatively new to this. So let's start by looking at the intent of the rule. The intent is to block illegitimate card-not-present fraud disputes, right? Which we call the 10.4 disputes from entering the ecosystem. So we stop it right at the point of origination. Unlike in other cases where once a dispute is raised, all that the merchant can do is to provide evidence to show that it was incorrectly raised. So they're effectively guilty, otherwise proven, unless proven otherwise. In the case of C3.0, the merchant can stop the dispute even before it is raised. So that is the value of this rule change. So how do they do that? So if the merchant can establish a pattern of past purchase behavior for the same cardholder, which were not disputed, then they can successfully argue that the transactions now being disputed belongs to the same pattern of behavior and is therefore illegitimate. Okay, so how do they do that? First, the merchant must establish, as I said, a past purchase history by the cardholder, which we call as the historical footprint. We need 2 to 5 transactions minimum of 2 or maximum 5 transactions in the past that were done using the same card and were not fraud reported. The cardholder never reported fraud on those transactions. And for sale and account funding transactions or AFTs, they must have occurred between 120 and 365 days from the date of the dispute. So if I'm raising a dispute today, if there are transactions, sale transactions or AFT transactions that I did in the past between 120 and 365, starting 120 days back from today, up to 365 days, that constitutes historical transaction or historical footprints. So why that period? Because this transaction should have aged out of the dispute window, right? But for OCTs, there is a nuance. OCTs or original credit transactions can be between 0 and 365 days, just a nuance for OCTs. Okay, that's the first thing. Second, there are a set of data elements that a merchant must store for every transaction. These data elements for every transaction, every sale, or every AFT. Third, when the dispute is being raised on a sale, let's say, in the pre-dispute stage, before the dispute gets into the ecosystem, the issuer is trying to raise a dispute, we send an inquiry to the merchant through our Order Insight API for them to provide the details of the sale, which should include these data elements, right? So this is pre-dispute. That is before the dispute is in the network. We'll talk about how it works in the post-dispute stage a little later, but let's stick to the pre-dispute stage for a moment. So we will send the transaction for the merchant to respond. We will then retrieve those historical transactions from our database and send them to the merchant again by the same API and for the merchant to provide the same details. And then when the merchant provides those details again, there is a matching logic that looks at those data elements and compares them between the disputed and the historical transaction. If the logic finds that at least 2 historical transactions have the same data as a disputed transaction, we then say then there is enough evidence for a liability shift from the merchant to the issuer for this specific dispute. And the dispute will not be allowed to proceed. That is, the merchant will see a very positive dispute block when they are able to supply these data elements. And remember, though, that all this is happening real time or near real time, right? So this inquiries are sent through the API. Visa Verifi checks the validity of this data element in real time. If the dispute is blocked, Visa will notify the issuer the dispute is blocked in real time, that the liability is now theirs. And we, meaning Verifi, will inform the merchant that they have successfully blocked the dispute. That's also happening real time. So all of this is real time. The merchant gets a notification almost in real time that because they supplied the right data, they got a dispute block. Now, for any reason, if you're not able to stop the dispute at the pre-dispute stage, that is, if you're not able to source the data, if you're not able to respond back within the time frame, you can still do it at the pre-arb or the post-dispute stage. Post-dispute works slightly differently, and we will see that soon. But before we get there, Greg, let me ask you, can you explain the difference between the pre-dispute and the post-dispute scenarios?
Yeah, Vivek, thank you first and foremost for that deep dive into what the actual rule is. I know we live it and breathe it here at Verifi and Visa, but I know that there are a lot of other people in the ecosystem that are still becoming familiar with this rule. So as Vivek mentioned, there are really 2 ways that merchants can look to implement this rule. It's in the pre-dispute state and the post-dispute state. And the benefits are similar, but there are some big differences that we're going to talk through today. So the pre-dispute process is integrating directly to a Verifi solution called Order Insight. And basically what this does is this automates this entire process, right? So we get the information from the issuers. Verifi then calls you, the merchant, to say, hey, do you have the information? We bring it back and we evaluate. To simplify it, we evaluate everything and basically make the determination on the criteria from Visa. Yeah, this meets all the criteria, that this is a dispute that can now be deflected because it meets all the criteria for compelling evidence 3.0. So it's a very, very, this free-flowing amount of data to be able to do that. And so what it does is we actually, when you meet all the criteria, in both cases, it actually shifts liability from you, the merchant, back to essentially the cardholder, right? So think of this as a win, as a chargeback win. So you as a merchant were able to provide the correct data elements to say, yep, we're taking advantage of this rule. We believe this to be first-party misuse, and here's the data across the disputed transaction and the two historic transactions. It all matches up, meets the requirements. We're good to go, right? So that's wonderful. Big benefit there is automates the win. You as the merchant retain the sale, right? And secondly, in both cases here, we're talking, you get the benefit of fraud ratio. So each time you as a merchant win using this rule or utilizing this rule, it actually gets backed out of your fraud dispute ratio. So keep in mind, this is specifically for 10.4 card not present fraud transactions. So each time you win, the rule says this is not a fraudulent dispute. That information gets backed out. So it really helps create a holistic approach to fraud. So I know most of you are probably using some sort of fraud engine at the time of authorization, whether it be homegrown or something you partner with. But this allows you to actually take advantage of that on the back end as well in this post-purchase sort of environment. One of the differences here is the dispute ratio protection. So this is only available through the pre-dispute process. Since the rule was, since the dispute was never filed officially, then winning it through this will actually mean that there was never a dispute actually filed. So if you do have any sort of, chargeback fees from your acquirers or anything like that, those would not be applied here. Some of the things, so these are the benefits that we can offer, but there are also some advantages of using the pre-dispute process that we really didn't put up here, but they're worthwhile to really talk about. So I think the first one here is just automation, right? So keep in mind, in the pre-dispute process, this is just a free-flowing API calls, moving data back and forth. There's no person on the back end having to research the historic transaction, research the disputed transaction, try to grab all this information, put it in a nice little package in a representment, and send it back up to their acquirer, right? So the time for all this to take place is within a matter of seconds versus if you have some sort of internal team that are looking to do this in the post-dispute process, where they're having to research this or you're having to build something in-house to try to make this more efficient for them. So that's really one of the biggest benefits here. The other thing that we heard from one of our customers recently who implemented the solution was in the pre-dispute process, since all this information is ultimately getting fed back to Verifi and ultimately to Visa, there's really no dependencies from anybody else in the payments ecosystem. So, this particular client said that there was a particular challenge with a particular issuer. They really weren't, they weren't great to work with when it came to disputes. But by using this pre-dispute process, they actually are communicating directly with Visa and they don't have any dependency there. So they're going straight to the source versus in the post-dispute, the flow is, all right, I submit this back to my acquirer and then it goes back to the issuer. So it really just creates this overall streamlined process across the board to create these efficiencies for merchants who are integrating to Order Insight to take advantage of this compelling evidence 3.0 rule. So we've talked very theoretically to this point about what this looks like. So we have an example here that we want to show on this next slide. So here is a sneaker purchase. So a lot of data here, but I'll walk you through it real quick. So on November 18th, a dispute was filed, 10.4 fraudulent dispute for a purchase that was made on November 15th for, looks like, size 7 sneakers. And so in this example, you can see these are the data elements that Vivek had discussed: user ID, IP address, shipping address, and device ID. And so in this particular case, the first hurdle is we need to find 2 historic transactions, or you do as the merchant need to find 2 historic transactions to see if this customer has transacted with you before to create this historic footprint. And so in this example, we found one on July 13th and one on June 25th. So those sit outside that 120-day window, but within 365 days. So you have to have that 8-month window to identify these transactions. And this was the information that was captured on those transactions at the time of purchase. So all we need here is to have two of these data elements match across all three transactions, and one of them has to be either IP address or device ID. So let's take a look. So in this particular case, it looks like user ID matches across all three. It looks like IP address does not match across all three, matches on the two historic, but not the transaction dispute. So no go there. It looks like shipping address matches, and then device ID matches. So even though we only need two data elements to meet the minimum of the rule, in this example, we have three, with one of them being device ID to meet those requirements. So in this particular example, whether in pre or post dispute, merchants can take advantage of this by providing this information. And if they do it in a timely manner, this would result in a deflection. So, Babak, I talked a lot about the pre-dispute process. I know that you have done some work extensively in the post-dispute process. So if merchants are looking to implement something in the post-dispute, I think we've got some words of wisdom for them.
Thank you. Words of wisdom. Okay. So now that we have seen how the pre-dispute works, I want to share how merchants can benefit from the C3 protection in the post-dispute or the pre-ARB phase of the dispute processing. Now remember, by this time, the dispute is already in the ecosystem. The acquirer has got it. You as a merchant may have also gotten information that the dispute is there. So in this scenario, the acquirer, in association with you, the merchant, manually chooses exactly two transactions to establish the historical footprint. The difference between this and the pre-dispute process, as Greg mentioned, that in the pre-dispute scenario, Verifi vRole chooses those historical transactions based on the inquiry. Here, acquirer chooses those two transactions based on, in collaboration with the merchant. And there's a questionnaire that the acquirer has to complete in order to get the rule coverage. In the questionnaire, they would choose the compelling evidence remedy as a reason for their pre-ARB submission. So you have to submit the pre-ARB, you choose the compelling evidence as remedy as a reason for the submission. Once they submit, then Visa matches the data supplied by the merchant with the data in the dispute. The dispute has already come in, we have the data, the 4 data elements that Greg mentioned, and if they match, the dispute is blocked and a fraud report is deleted. So thing to note here, that this is acquirer specific, right? So this dispute has gone to the acquirer. So all the historical transactions have to be acquired by the same acquirer. So they have to match the disputed and the historical transactions that the acquirer has for the merchant. How does the acquirer do that? How do the acquirer submit the dispute? They can use they can actually use the existing integration to Visa's Resolve Online to submit the information. So the difference here again is that you don't need a separate connection. If you're participating in the post-dispute scenario, you don't need to integrate with any other API. You already have, the acquirers already have an integration to vRole. They can use the same integration to submit the historical transactions and the evidence, right? But again, this is not real time. The acquirer submits, there's a processing, and all of that happens in pre-dispute. On the other hand, it is real time. Now, we know that some acquirers have begun adopting this new CE3 questionnaire, but not all have done it so far. We are urging all the acquirers to adopt this new rule change, and we urge you as merchants who wants to benefit from the CE protection to also contact your acquirer to adopt that updated questionnaire. Our suggestion is use both. Use the pre-dispute as well as the post-dispute. Gives you better leverage and better opportunity, more opportunity to combat the friendly fraud. Now let's talk about a case study to kind of exemplify how this works. Greg, I know you have a case study. Do you want to share that with us?
Yes, Vivek, thank you. Yeah, we have a couple of case studies here. And this is really just from talking to clients, merchants in the market. And we chose the airline and OTA industry because we think there's application for this particular tool, and then also in recurring. So think recurring is, subscription billers, things like that. So, there's a couple of things to know on these individual use cases and why we think pre-dispute is really effective, right? So there can be some challenges in like the airline and OTA space, right? So we typically don't see it nearly as much in terms of, like, say, somebody disputing a fare, especially if they've already taken the flight, because there are some very specific rules for airlines and OTAs around that protect merchants. But really what we see is, if you're an airline, we see disputes for the kind of the ancillary purchases, right? If there's a seat upgrade or any sort of Wi-Fi in-cabin sort of purchase, or any sort of just kind of baggage fees, anything that cardholders really have a tough time remembering, right? They remember they bought the flight, but all those ancillary things coming together can create some issues for them. And so what we've seen is that there's applicability for compelling evidence to be able to help dispute those transactions, or deflect those transactions, when we see those coming in, and really create some efficiencies with the airlines and in the OTAs. Secondly, here with the recurring and the subscription billers, this compelling evidence rule is essentially, I would say it fits perfectly for these types of billers, right? So, these types of customers typically see, these sort of fraud reported down the line. Somebody signs up for something, doesn't necessarily remember or forgets to cancel. And so these sorts of transactions get disputed, and sometimes they come in batches too. So the cardholder is not disputing one; they're disputing multiple, transactions within a certain period. And so by utilizing this compelling evidence rule in this instance, we're really lowering the total operational costs that merchants have, because again, that automation just runs in the background. So there's not people doing this. And then it allows them to really maintain those thresholds and ratios below the 90 basis points for fraud, the fraud monitoring program and the dispute monitoring program. So really good applicability in these. And then keep in mind, there are multiple use cases outside of these two scenarios. We just found for this webinar, these were something that we found interesting and really wanted to share with you, some of these examples as we move forward. So I think what we can do here is, on this next slide, is I think we want to share some additional data. So I lied to you all earlier. I said there's no more stats. We have a couple more stats. So really, I guess kind of in summary, what we're looking to do here is as a card brand, as a payment ecosystem, we're looking to fight against first-party misuse globally. And we think that this is a good first step to be able to do this. And the way that we believe is the most efficient for the ecosystem in general, all participants in the ecosystem, and I'll say specifically to merchants, is to automate this solution to be able to act as a first defense whenever you are trying to get rid of these 10.4 disputes. And again, 10.4 on average makes up about 70 to 80% of the disputes that we see coming into the ecosystem. And again, this problem is growing, 49 billion in 2030. That's a big opportunity for merchants across the globe to look at ways to create scale and efficiency by adopting new technology and taking advantage of new rules that card brands like Visa are putting out to the market, right? This is one of the first times that Visa has done something like this, made it crystal clear for merchants on how you can actually utilize these rules to protect your businesses and create those efficiencies, retain sales, lower costs that we really talked about. So what we want to do here is just kind of share the data from really where we are right now. And I think we came out of, we started our pilot phase in June, July of this past year, and really have seen really good momentum up to this point. So, up to this point right now, I think these metrics are through March. We've seen 296,000 deflections for around $39.7 million. So let's say $40 million. So this tool, within its first year and with a very limited number of merchant participants at this point, has deflected $40 million of disputes and put that back into the pockets of those businesses who have implemented Order Insight in this pre-dispute process. And second, and then lastly here, when we see all that, when we get the data lined up and we get the responses we need from the merchants, I'm not going to go too technical into, the everything that's required, but we see a 45 to 70% deflection rate when we have everything that we need to fight this. So again, we feel very bullish on this. We are still working to optimize the solution, not only internally here at Verifi and Visa, but also with our merchants. So I think it's fair to say that these numbers will only get better over time. So let's move to the next slide. And Babek, you have some, I guess, some additional words of wisdom for merchants to help, what merchants can do to kind of help them set themselves up for success in the pre-dispute process.
Absolutely, we'll be happy to. So let's discuss a few things that merchants can do to set themselves up for success. I mean, the stats speak for themselves. It is a huge boost to the merchants, but how do they get set? How do they get ready for this? So it's all about data, right? Like Greg mentioned, I mentioned in the past, it's all about data. So first you need to analyze as a merchant that you have the necessary data to maximize the outcome. That means you should be ready to source and store the data needed to ensure reflection, right? These are the data elements that we talked about: account ID, IP address, device ID, fingerprint, and delivery address, and so on and so forth. If not, if you see that you are not storing this information today for every single transaction, then initiate programs to start sourcing them and storing them. Remember that to build a historical footprint, you will need to store this data consistently for at least 125 days and more. Only then they will become eligible to participate in the program as a historical transaction. Also, as you know, there is a matching logic for these data elements. We need 2 of these 4 data elements to match, but one of them has to be either IP address or device ID or device fingerprint. So if you're unable to source all the data elements for any reason, you must store either the IP or the device ID / device fingerprint. Any of these 2 will do, either the device ID or the device fingerprint. But our recommendation is the more data you are able to provide, source, store, and provide, the better is your chance of effecting a deflection, as you can understand. Because you don't know what the original transactions will bring and what kind of matching logic there is. So to maximize your chance of success, store all the data if you can possibly do so. Now, evaluate your readiness to meet the response SLA. That can you integrate to our API even if you're not already integrated? Can you integrate to the API in the pre-dispute phase and respond within our SLA of 2 seconds? So we expect the merchant response within 2 seconds to evaluate whether you are able to do that. So you may have to evaluate your data storage and data archival policies, your data retrieval efficiency, like the queries that are bringing the data, sourcing the data up from your database and sending it to the API. You need to evaluate all of that and see if you are able to respond to that SLA for 2 seconds. If you are not able to, we are happy to work with you to kind of tell you what others have done to kind of get you there. And so this is the pre-dispute phase. Post-dispute, as you know, you don't have to have an API integration. The acquirer has an integration to Virol, so you'll be able to provide that information there. But again, post-dispute is already in the ecosystem. It's like sitting against you and stuff like that. So we'd recommend that you really strongly evaluate your pre-dispute readiness. Lastly, to ensure that the data you're collecting is stored and sent in the right format, super critical, you should evaluate what kind of data, again, what collection mechanism, how you're validating the information, how you're storing the information, and so on. For example, we expect the IP to be stored in IPv4 or IPv6 format. The device ID should be minimum of 15 characters and maximum of 35 characters, and so on. So how do you know that? Our API specs is the guiding document that will help you kind of understand what kind of format do you need to store the data in. Please reach out to us if you know the API spec, if you don't have it already. We just recently released a brand new spec. Greg can connect you with the right folks on our side. From a product perspective, if you have a question on the spec, we can help you to kind of understand how the specs work, how the integration works, and so on and so forth. Now, Greg interestingly talked about subscription merchants, right? Subscription billers. There's a very interesting use case that we have seen in our experience in the past 1 year. So the way that this works for the subscription billers is that after the first transaction by the user, by the cardholder, where they set up their account and make their first transaction, which is, as many of you know, is called the CIT, or the customer initiated transaction. The subsequent transactions are initiated by the merchant, right? So I set up my account, I'm subscribing to a service, and I set up my account as give my credit card, the first transaction occurs, and I'm billed monthly or quarterly or whatever the frequency is from the biller for my subscription. So the subsequent transactions are, as you know, MITs or merchant initiated. Now for these billers, the biller can leverage the data elements received through the first CIT to populate the subsequent MITs. So that's a great advantage for the billers, subscription billers. So they can, if they store the data elements from the first CIT, the CIT that I as a cardholder did when setting up the account, they can use those same data elements to populate the subsequent MITs. This is a very strong business case for those billers to be on this program. We've actually seen the past 1 year since we launched, all our subscription billers have had tremendous success. Greg talked about the deflection rates of 45% to 70%. We actually have seen subscription billers in the range of like 90% plus. So if you are a subscription biller, please do take advantage of this rule change, talk to us, and we'll help you get there. Greg, let's talk about how additional automation can help the merchants, if you can take us through that.
Yeah, thanks, Vivek. Yeah, so up to this point, right, we've really focused in pre-dispute. And again, pre-dispute is before a chargeback has really come into play. And that's kind of Order Insight is the first line of defense. There's also a second line of defense in pre-dispute. So there are tools out there. Verifi has two of them. And really what they are is they're actually allowing merchants who would, if you think about the dispute flow, are kind of last to know, moves them up to kind of the front of the line to connect directly to issuers and make a decision on whether or not they, as a merchant, want to accept certain types of disputes. And again, the goal here is to create a better customer experience, create efficiencies by filtering out a lot of the noise that some of these disputes bring, and then lowering costs. And in some cases, this can reduce the time from, days or weeks to real time in 1 second. And so we'll talk through rapid dispute resolution, RDR affectionately, and then cardholder dispute resolution network, CDRN, which is a Verifi product that's been in market for quite some time. I think probably 15 years now is where it is. So they have similar outcomes, but the way in which they solve it is very different. So think about this as RDR is a rules-based engine where you, the merchant, can select based on a criteria of attributes available, which disputes you want to proactively accept and which ones you want to flow through the normal dispute process, right? And so we'll go through an example here, but I would say the most common we see merchants using is transaction amount. And so that's real time. And so if those pre-disputes meet your criteria as a merchant, then essentially they don't move any further, right? So there's no other action that you need to take as the merchant. Your acquirer reports them as accepted RDR cases, and essentially it allows your teams who are working on disputes to focus on what you deem high value disputes, whatever that may be. Secondly is cardholder dispute resolution network, CDRN. I'm just going to call it CDRN from here on out. So similar sort of function, but what this is akin to a manual review for fraud. So you as the merchant would receive this dispute, and you have 72 hours to respond to us in our portal. And so that gives your teams time to research these disputes and determine whether or not this is something that you want to accept and really kind of just make go away. So very, kind of different workflows, but again, the outcome is the same. One thing to note about the differences between the solutions is RDR is specific to Visa, and CDRN is card brand agnostic. So you're going to see Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express on that particular tool. So again, just really a second line of defense when Order Insight or compelling evidence can't or doesn't stop or prevent the dispute from coming in, this is that second line to really merchants can use. And we have some examples here on the next slide of how RDR can be used and some of the benefits, right? So we mentioned 97% global issuers. So if you're in the US, it's 97% global coverage. And across the rest of the world, in most areas, it's 100%, with the exception of APAC, which is Asia Pacific, which is over 90%. And so some of the attributes that we really see is transaction amount. So quick example of that is that if you're a merchant and you decide, you know what, any transaction under $30 really just doesn't make a lot of sense for us. I want every dispute under $30 to be resolved via RDR. I'll do that, and the tool will do that. And then anything outside of that will continue through the overall process. So again, we kind of hit on a lot of these advantages already, but we've seen huge adoption of RDR. And I think that the thing that continues to stick out is the ease in which it makes working these disputes for merchants is kind of, it's been in market for a while, but I don't think there's really anything like it that created this much efficiency and this much scale where this tool fits within particular merchant segments. So really good. If you're interested in that, again, we're happy to have more in detailed discussions, walk you through which rules might be applicable to your business, and which ones, which disputes you deem as high value. All right, so taking the next slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about CDRN. So like I said, similar process. This gives you the greater visibility, and really both of these solutions are focused on giving you a heads up as a merchant. So even if you decide, you know what, I don't, you evaluate in the 72-hour window, you really don't, you decide that this doesn't meet the criteria for you to accept this dispute, then what it does is it actually gives you a heads up. So if there's a very large dispute that's coming down the pipe, you and your team can be ready for this and have your ducks in a row when you actually receive that from the acquirer a few days later. And again, this just gives you a little bit more time. CDRN gives you a little bit more time to really focus on that 72-hour review period to make the best decision. And keep in mind too, plenty of merchants use both of these tools simultaneously. So it's not one or the other. You can actually use them together and expand optimal coverage across most of these networks. So with that, I want to say thank you to everyone for sticking with us here.